On Saturday the 4th of September 2021, the Linen Hall Library launched its Ireland Divided programme of events with a social history event called The People's History of Partition with historical consultants Dr. Eamon and Professor Diane Urquhart. It was the first in-person event at the Linen Hall Library since March 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Having revisited our collections from the period, we were additionally curious about the artefacts and stories which were in the hands of the general public. And so we issued an open invitation to the public to come forward with their artefacts and stories from the period to share them with the Ireland Divided project.
If you were taught history like that at school, you would actually enjoy and remember more.
The response was remarkable. And at times, the stories went beyond those of the dominant political narratives. We heard stories of Eddie Spence's famous chip shop in East Belfast, opened in 1921 and celebrating its centenary year. We also had stories of local football, where Linfield Football Club won an unprecedented 7 trophies in the 1921-1922 season. Richard O'Leary also shared fascinating items relating to his late father-in-law, George Kingston, a southern Protestant from Cork who, as a consequence of partition, migrated from Cork to Northern Ireland and settled in Belfast in 1929.
My late father-in-law, he was born and grew up in Cork, and as a teenager he would have experienced partition, and in the 1920s he decided to leave what was then the Irish Free State, come north and to live in Northern Ireland. And in 1934 he would have obtained a local Northern Ireland driving licence, but the following year in 1935 he obviously had to return briefly to Cork, and he needed a driving licence to enable him to drive in the south, which is a driving licence issued by Saoirstát Éireann. And given that my late father-in-law was a Southern Unionist and Protestant, I think he would have found it quite challenging to have to obtain a driving licence from Saoirstát Éireann.
Well, look, Sheila, this is incredible. I mean, the way it's mounted, and it takes us right back. This is your grandfather.
It's my grandfather, William James Partition.
And of course you never knew him because of the tragic circumstances of his death.
He didn't know any of his grandchildren.
So what did you hear about your grandfather?
When I was a child, this lived behind our sofa.
Yes.
In East Belfast.
Yes.
And every now and again, if we had a special visitor,
yes,
it would be brought out and the story told.
Yes.
Basically how he survived the war.
Yes.
And came home and went to work in Little Patrick Street.
Yes.
In a cooperage.
Yes.
And one day when he was during the Troubles, yes, in the 21-22 Troubles, he was at work one day and some boys came in and took him and 2 colleagues, asked who were Protestants, and let the other guy go. But anyway, he ended up putting 3 of them against the wall. They were offered blindfolds, but he refused. He had words to the effect that he'd faced the Germans and he wasn't going to, in his own home,
yes,
going to have a blindfold. So they were shot. They were all shot. And I often wondered how that story about the blindfold ever came home. when they were all
Well, it's a
shot.
really tragic story, and it's a really tragic period. I mean, as you probably know, 200,000 men from this island fought in the First World War, but 40,000 were killed from the Shankill to the Falls, from north and south, and all of that. And these men returned, of course, those who survived, like your grandfather, to an island of Ireland on the brink of war again. You know, as the Home Rule crisis had just been placed in kind of cold storage, but it all re-emerges again in 1919, 1920. The Belfast Troubles explode in July 1920, and over the next 2 years, 450 people are killed, mainly civilians, a lot of innocent victims, a lot of them ex-soldiers, actually. So some of the ex-soldiers are drawn into the violence on both sides, the IRA, the Specials, various other kind of paramilitary groups. And this continues. Churchill talks about it being cannibalism, except they didn't devour the flesh of the victims, but it was cannibalism he describes it as. So that's the kind of background, intense violence. Some weeks perhaps you have 40, 50 people, 70 people killed in May 22. The immediate background of the violence he died in was Ireland was not only divided by 1922, but there was a civil war brewing in the south because the IRA had split over the treaty. Michael Collins was under pressure, and he had authorised a northern IRA upsurge in May 1922. And the idea was that every IRA division, and that was about all told about 5,000 men from Belfast to Fermanagh, would rise up on a given day, the 17th of May, and there would be major burning of big houses like Shane's Castle, railways, bombs in Belfast, attacks on the police, all of that. So this is what began to happen in the middle of May 1922, and there was an awful lot of sectarian violence in Belfast. During that, this incident stands out because the IRA, was a lot of sectarian violence on both sides, but the IRA in this particular instance, a very, very brutal sectarian killing, went into the cooperage and lined up the Protestant men there. And I certainly knew there were 5 or 6 people I thought killed. You say there were 3, but I thought there were 5. I thought it stands out. Now, if you read the statements of the IRA, a lot of people weren't very happy with this. They felt it was very sectarian, but it happened. And your grandfather, who was a soldier of the Great War, Sapper William Partition, he was one of the victims. So it's a terrible period in Belfast history. It'll all come to an end about September 22, the last of the violence, but there's an uneasy peace. And even in the 30s, as you know, there were barricades up at the Short Strand and the Newton Eyres Road interface, even then, the 35 riots. But he stands out because he's fought in the Great War, he's highly decorated, he comes home, he's lucky to get a job, and he's the victim of a sectarian mass murder. So it's very, very sad.
Yeah.
And this was obviously his wife wanted to remember. I mean, he's only in his 30s. Well, thanks very much for bringing it in, Sheila. It's just super, and bringing it up. And thanks for this. We have the picture here of the family left behind after the tragic death of your grandfather.